too much. So we've got our URL, domain.com, maybe it's blackboard.com. What do you suppose would happen at that URL? Kind of an instruction in a way. Right, so we're going to go to the database. So this will use our model, right, and find so according to this diagram, our client makes a request to the web server, that's the dispatcher, our web server, and this particular URL, it's a specific instruction. So the way that the web server is going to interpret this URL, and again, this is in any MVC pattern, not specific to ASP.NET. It's going to look for a controller called in this case, it would be, we're going to have a file called studentscontroller.cs. It'll be a C# file. And inside the students controller file, it would actually live in a folder called controllers. Visual Studio will very nicely set up folders for us called models, views, and controllers. So inside controllers, we'll have a file called students controller. This file will handle all of the logic to do with anything to do with students in the application. Viewing, adding, editing, deleting, anything else, whatever else a student could do. Register, drop course, those would all be, each of those would be methods. So inside of here, we're going to have an edit method. The edit method is going to take one parameter. What kind of parameter is this edit method going to need? Right, and what data type would that ID be? More specifically. What type of data? Somebody said it. Yeah, it's going to be an integer. And then somewhere in our database, we have a students table. Where we have this student. So this is the way MVC works. Our URL contains a specific instruction. First, it says what controller is going to handle the request. And then within this file, the URL then says what method or action within the controller do we want to do. And then if this method takes any information, what's that information that's needed? So our edit method queries our database, passes in ID 123. It talks to our model. Our model returns back a student object with the ID, first name, last name, student email, whatever other info. The controller then takes this object, this student, and hands it back, and it will load a view called edit, and it will say, load this page, and here's the student data to render on the page in a form so the user might change something. If maybe we're filling out, maybe we're loading a view called, let's say we've got in .NET MVC, it would be students /create. So I click a link and it calls this URL, students create. What do you suppose, what would I expect to see in my browser at that URL? Are you? Right, we'd see a form. So in this case, the dispatcher would go to the controller, it would call a create method. The create method wouldn't need to talk to our model in this case. It would just directly load an empty form where we could add a new student. And then when we click submit, we'd actually have two different versions of create. I'm kind of making a mess here. We'd have a get version that loads the form. And then when the user clicks the submit button, we'd have a second create method, but instead of doing get, what would it do? It would do a post. So get would display an empty form to the user and it would stop. We call get, controller just displays our view. User enters the new student, clicks submit. They're making a new request, again at same URL, students create, but now it's a post. So the controller says, oh, it's a post. I'm going to take that info from the form. I'm going to dump it into the database, and I'll maybe return the new student ID. And either I'll load the same page with a confirmation, or I'll take the user off somewhere else. I'll load a different view. Maybe I'll take them back to the list of students, and I can see the new student on the bottom of that list. So this isn't specific to ASP.NET, but this is how the general pattern works. And in this case, in our class, these views are going to be web pages, but they don't have to be web pages. What else could we use instead of just a web page for the view layer? What other options would we have? Sorry? Yep, could be a Windows application, a desktop application. What else could we use for the, yeah, right? We can still write the controller for the logic, the model for the data, but maybe the views are a series of iOS or Android screens for the front end. Which brings us to some of the more important questions about MVC, which are, why would we adopt this? Why do you suppose this has become so popular? It offers a number of advantages to us as developers. Okay, yep, so that's a good point. So the pattern is reusable. If they've used MVC, which more and more of them do now, then yes. What other benefits would this offer? Steven? Okay, can you explain? It is easier to debug. Why? Okay. Yep, true. Anything else about this? Okay, this is useful in a few ways, right? Why would it be useful to divide the data, the logic, and the user interface? Think about if we're working in a team environment. If we can separate these things out, how does this help us? Right, so Luis is going to do all the logic. Ryan is going to do all the UI. Ari is going to handle all the data. And each is going to say to the other, don't touch my stuff. Right? But it means debugging is easier. If we run this request and we get an error, that somehow it can't fetch a student back, well, then we know the problem is likely in the model. It has nothing to do with the view or the UI. If we have a UI error, it doesn't affect the back-end logic. So it makes it easier to divide the work, or it could be maybe we have students, faculty, and courses. Maybe you're going to do everything with students, you're going to do everything with courses, you're going to do everything with faculty. Again, we can split that up into neat components. So we get that separation of concerns. That makes debugging easier. It lets us divide the labor. What else does that allow us to do? We can work more efficiently. Think about the work you did in your PHP class. Maybe we'll pull up a PHP file here that I built last fall when I taught PHP. So here is, let's see. Okay, here's a list of restaurants we built last fall in PHP. So we've got the header. We're doing an authentication check. We have a whole bunch of HTML. We've got database code where we're filling a drop down. connecting to the database. So we're constantly jumping in and out of PHP and HTML. I've got a whole bunch of logic here. Is there a keyword included in the search? So everything's all jammed together in one file, right? There's the HTML for the presentation. There's all the database code for dealing with the data. And then there's the logic of what we're doing. So debugging this or being able to divide the work on this is virtually impossible to do. One person has to do it, and all three functions are jammed in one file. So when we use MVC, we get a lot more files, but each individual file is a lot smaller, and they're designed to do specific things. It also means that we can reuse code easily. We can reuse code across applications. So if one client asks us to build, let's say they need an event module, right? I want to have an event calendar on my website where I can add events in the admin portal of my site. People can see them, browse the calendar, register for events. So we build that for one project. Well, if we use MVC, we now have a controller with a whole bunch of methods for how to manage events. And we have a model that describes what an event is. So now we have another client that wants an event calendar. We have these modules, we can just plug them in. And we can just build them a different set of views for their own site. Or maybe we build a site today and our client uses it and it gets widely used and it's working well. And in a couple of years, which tends to be the life cycle for UIs these days, client says, I need a new look for the site. When we build our sites this way, we have to rip apart the whole thing, and there's a good chance we can mess up the database code or break the logic while we're redoing the UI. Here, when all our views are separate, we can keep the whole back end working and change this stuff. We can change all the HTML, front end, JavaScript, CSS, but we haven't had to touch anything in the back end. So it's much easier for us to modify that UI with this kind of modular approach. No, it's not using MVC model. That's just a procedural model. It's not using this pattern. In this pattern, the views, controllers, and models are actually separate files on their own. So you will not see database code in a view in MVC. In that PHP example, we had database code right in those views. They were together, they were not separate files. Here, physically, they're separate files that live in separate folders. It takes a little while when we get started getting used to the pattern. It may take you a few weeks to get your head around it, but once you do, suddenly it becomes very easy to work with. And Visual Studio will automate a lot of the manual grunt repetitive work for us. So ASP.NET is one technology that supports MVC. What are some other ones? We want to do MVC, but we're not using ASP.NET. What else could we use instead? Yep. Well, we are doing C. C# is the language of ASP.NET. I don't know if C++ will support MVC. Yeah, okay. We can, it's not built into PHP, but there are MVC frameworks. Probably the most popular one is called Laravel, which is adding a PHP structure to, adding an MVC structure to a PHP context. We can do it, we can and we will do it with JavaScript. We'll do it in January using Node. And probably the first really popular, the first language to really make MVC popular was this framework. So Ruby on Rails was the first widely used web framework, and that kind of popularized MVC. So when Ruby on Rails came out, ASP.NET didn't support it. PHP and JavaScript, none of those languages supported MVC. but the developers of all of those said, hey, we like that pattern and we can use it. So ASP.NET has been around since 2002. And as I said, I think it didn't add MVC until 2008, but that's now 11 years ago. So .NET MVC is quite a mature product. Been around for a long time. And there's actually a new version out. And the new version, it has lots of similarities. It still uses the MVC pattern, but it now will finally run for years and years. You could only run ASP.NET on Windows. You can now run it on OS X. You can run it on Linux. And the new version also, well, actually, I won't say anything else, but does anybody know what it's called? Yeah, so it's now called .NET Core. So if we look at code samples in the official documentation, we're typically going to have two choices. It'll ask whether we're using MVC with the .NET framework, that's the old version that's been around, that runs on Windows, or whether we're using .NET Core, which is the new version of MVC. So .NET Core is cross-platform. Did anybody have a chance to answer the last question about what's different about it? It's still MVC, but it's not quite the same as the traditional MVC. Yep, so it is cross-platform. It runs much faster than traditional .NET MVC. So this is one of the reasons. This is the direction Microsoft is going in. Up until now, when I've taught this class, we've primarily used the traditional MVC framework, and we've done a few weeks at the end of the class just to introduce .NET Core. And every time I teach the class, what I do is go and scour the ASP.NET job listings, and I check whether I'm seeing .NET Core in the requirements. And every semester before this one, most of the jobs still asked for the traditional .NET framework version. When I looked a few weeks ago, I would say at least half the jobs now are actually asking for .NET Core because it's newer, it's faster. This is the direction Microsoft is going in. So I've decided for the first time, we're going to use .NET Core exclusively. Okay? It's more lightweight, it's faster. One of the other big differences is .NET Core, it prefers JSON. The old version for things like configuration files, it used XML, whereas .NET Core will use JSON. So basically, Microsoft looked at everybody that was switching to using Node.js, and they tried to borrow some of the better features from Node.js and bring them into ASP.NET. So .NET Core looks more like Node.js than the traditional .NET framework does.
When we were installing Visual Studio, whatever, there was an option at the bottom of the core. Did we have to have that selected? Install?
What we do need the .NET Core software development kit, but it's also available as a separate download. So we'll install that. We'll actually do that in a minute. I can put up the link for that. Okay. So there's two other things that Microsoft created when they created Visual Studio, when they created the .NET framework way back in 2002. There were two features that they added that web developers never had before, that desktop programmers had if you were going to build programs that could be installed on someone's operating system. But if you were building something to run in a browser, there were two really key features that never existed before ASP.NET. And they were this. I should add this to the list. So what is compiled? ASP.NET was the first web technology that allowed us to run compiled instead of interpreted code on a web server. What the heck does that mean in plain everyday language? So just PHP code is not compiled, it's interpreted, but ASP.NET code is compiled. Guessing is fine, go for it.
But is compiler something that converts a language into something that you can understand easily? A lower level language, for example?
That's an excellent answer, and it's absolutely correct. Hang on. So I'm going to add that. I should have added this into why we should learn it, okay? So what that something else is binary. It's ones and zeros. So ones and zeros are going to run faster than interpreting every line of a script like here. The compiled code also gets cached on the server, which makes it run even faster. Once it executes once, the server caches it, so subsequent requests are even faster. So there was no such thing. You could not write compiled code to run on a web server until ASP.NET was created. So not only is it faster, what are the other benefits of compiling our code? Can you explain why it's more secure, Stephen?
That's compiled into a DLL, and that DLL, you can't really look at it and figure out what's inside it. Whereas PHP or JavaScript, the code is exposed.
Right. So with this PHP file, when I put this up on the server, right, it has all my HTML, it has all my logic, it also has my database credentials, for example. So if somebody gets access to the web server, they have all of the code. With our ASP.NET sites, we don't actually have to put our source code on the server. We have to put our views, our HTML, our CSS, and our JavaScript. But all of the C# files, they get compiled into a single file, which, as Stephen mentioned, has an extension of DLL, Dynamic Link Library. It's basically a bunch of ones and zeros, the ones and zeros translation of all of our C# code. So that has to go on the server, but if the server gets hacked, the hacker only gets the compiled version. They get the ones and zeros. They don't actually get our actual code. So it's more secure. It also protects us as the developers because who has all of the C# files with the source code? We do on our own computers and backed up in the cloud on GitHub, of course. So if our client can't just go and start changing the logic of their applications because they don't have the uncompiled source code. They want the source code. Typically, they have to pay more. If you want a source code version of a software, you typically pay more than for the end user version. So it helps us protect our code from a security perspective, but also it helps us protect it that we're really the only ones who can change it. So that's one big benefit. The other thing that Visual Studio offered was runtime debugging. Now, for those of you who are in computer programmer, you've probably used the Java runtime debugger. So you can step through your code as it's running one line at a time and inspect it. And if you were in Keith's Programming Fundamentals class, you probably used the Visual Studio debugger for debugging your C#, right? We could click a button and then the debugger would jump us into our code window and we could watch our code execute one line at a time. So when things aren't working properly, we can see what's happening and figure it out. We were never able to do this with web applications until ASP.NET came along. So just like we use that debugging in Visual Studio for Windows applications, we can actually do it in the browser. So we can load a web page, click on a button, and then watch our server-side code execute one line at a time so we can figure out what it's doing, especially if it's not behaving the way we expect it to. So these were created when Visual Studio.NET came out in 2002, when I had the privilege of paying $1,700 US for the first copy of Visual Studio.NET Professional. Okay, so just before we open Visual Studio, we do want to add on so that we can do .NET Core. We want the .NET Core software development kit. So let me just throw that link up onto Blackboard in weekly learning and tools and resources. It may be here, but I don't think so. Do we have it here? No. Okay. Help if I spelled it right. It's the SDK. So just let me grab this link. Okay. Okay, so you can either go to the link directly. It's just .net.microsoft.com/download, or you can click on the link that I've now put in Weekly Learning Tools and Resources. It's down here at the bottom. It'll take you there. Once you get here, you want, depending on which version of Visual Studio you have, if you have 2019, you want this one, download the .NET Core SDK. If you have 2017, which is fine, this version says it's compatible with 2017, so download this one instead. So you can just download it and run the installer. I believe it will recognize your operating system, so if you are running a Mac, it should give you the proper download. So we'll let that run. It's almost time for us to take another little pause. Just before we do, I want to take a quick poll. So one thing that I like to do when I teach the class, for our in-class lessons, what I would like to do is typically create one web application that we build through the entire 4 months. So each week we just add new features on. And that way, at the end of the course, we have one big application we've built together. And that's kind of, you can use that as a model for your assignments where you're going to go and build something else. So in the past, we used to build, Microsoft had a whole tutorial series as an 11-part tutorial series. They created, I think, back in 2011. And it was building an online music store, like with a shopping cart and checkout and all the rest of it. So I've done that in the past. You can actually see the old screencasts are on YouTube. There's playlists for previous classes. But we built the music store so many times, I actually now kind of would prefer I'd like to build an online store with a shopping cart, but let's build something else. So if you give me a couple suggestions of what kind of online store we might want to build, we'll put on a few options and then we'll throw up the poll and we can take a vote. And that's what we'll build together in class. So what kind of store might you be interested in building? Sorry? Okay, so we could build a sporting goods store. That's one option. What else are you guys interested in? Okay, we could do a computer store. Sorry? Okay. You could do an art gallery. All right. All right. We could do that. That would be a totally different type of application, I think. But we can revisit that one for your assignment potentially. Okay, so all right. So if in a browser tab, okay, hang on. So here's your URL. So go to paulev.com/. /RichFreeman456. And you should be able to vote. If you can't vote, let me know. I may have to change some settings on the poll. Or you can use your phone through that texting. Just see that it's available.
It's not presenting yet.
Not presenting?
Not yet.
Okay, hang on, sorry.
Button up top.
I may have to activate it. I thought it was active already, but okay. Well, I did get a pet store assignment last year, and I did get an art gallery assignment last year. So if that's what you're interested in, you can always do those for your assignment. All right, so okay, so I think we're going to build a computers and computer parts store. So what we are going to need, all right, so we'll build a computer store. That makes it easy. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a 10-minute break. If our computer store is going to need a name, we're going to need a brand. So we're going to run 2 small competitions. The first one will happen over the break. I'll create a, actually, you can email it to me. Whoever can come up with the best name for our computer store and email it to me, and I will be the sole vote on that, will get 1 bonus % on their final grade. And then we'll also need a logo for the our computer store. So whoever can come up with my favorite computer store logo for next week, 1 bonus %. Sorry?
Do you like pies?
If it's a good one.
Okay.
All right. So if you have an idea of what you're going to name, we'll take 10-minute break. If you have an idea for what you want to call our computer store, send it to me in an email, and we'll pick the best name. And it'll be 1 bonus %. All right. We'll come back and we'll start building the store at 10:05.